Look at all this flashy showboating, right? You know what? It's my opinion that you don't really learn to use a hammer until you damage your elbow. Once you've damaged your elbow enough that it hurts to swing a hammer, then you can officially say that you know how to use a hammer. Because the process causes you to streamline your hammer use. You'll stop doing things that are unnecessary and start instead to relax, and the hammer becomes a fluid extension of your arm, and you no longer look like you're struggling. You can see noobs who don't know how to use a hammer and they look rigid. They look like this when they're pounding a hammer. I can tell. You can't fool me. It's one of those things like if you can write, then other people who can't write, their writing ability becomes transparent to you. So why should you listen to me? How do you know that I know how to use a hammer? What is my bona fides? Because I'm older than you think, and I was born and raised with one in my hand. I was born the son of a carpenter, and so by age 9 I had my own tool belt, and by age 13, since I was a natural climber and a fast learner, I was the point man on the trusses. At a time when pneumatic fasteners were not yet widespread, the hammer was your everything. It was with you all day, and it was an extension of your body. It becomes after a while so natural to use a hammer that you don't think of it as a tool so much anymore. You just don't even know that it's there. And people who don't possess the skill of hand nailing don't understand how much of a benefit it has to your life. It's the one skill that I've developed in my life that I wouldn't trade for anything else. You wouldn't believe the lateral application it has. The subject of this video is way down here. The Harbor Freight $5 hammer that looks like this when you buy it. And long story short, yes, you should buy one under certain conditions. To begin with, this is a 28-ounce S-wing. I consider it useless. If you're going to use a hammer that's that heavy for framing, then use a wooden handle like a Vaughn or something, just a simple head with a hickory handle.
Editor's note: hammer, as used in this video, is synonymous with rip hammer. That is to say, all hammers that are not rip hammers are completely useless and unnecessary. Specialty hammers notwithstanding, like those ball peen hammers and fancy little pointed things that welders use. But for the most part, if it uses wood, you should be using a rip hammer. Also, hammers that have all those notches and magnets and fancy looking aerodynamic tallywhackers hanging all over them, those are for children. And those are totally useless, not to be used by anybody that actually possesses skill with a hammer.
Hammer that I used the most in my the younger part of my career in framing was this, a 22-ounce S-wing, which now I also think is a bit heavy. The hammer that I used the most is this, a 16-ounce S-wing. Nice size, light, balanced, ergonomically flawless, and after a considerable break-in period, it's the hammer that I would take with me if I were to become stranded on an island with nothing else. This is its replacement. They changed its design a little bit over the years, but it remains fundamentally altered very little. In this case, I filed it down a little bit to get rid of its sharp edges because I no longer use a hammer so much that I would expect to develop a smoothing and a patina. It would take too long, and I just like that it has a softer handle now. This one, it shocks my arm too much, and so it is nice to have something that gives a little bit. This is a cheap replacement that I bought at Walmart about a decade back. Love this hammer. Every bit adequate replacement for an S-wing, and it's a fraction of the price. The handle was nice and smooth. Of course, you have to sand down the accident bump there. I don't know why they put those on hammers. When you're swinging and you're choked up, sometimes you'll hit it and it'll propel it forward. Good way to smash a finger when you're new. I sanded it off of this new Estwing. And it doesn't matter, after enough years they end up like this anyways. So, to this thing. Yes, the steel is softer than what you would find in an Estwing, but for what one of these cost, you could own 6 of these. And so if you have a shop, it's nice to have them laying everywhere. But you got to do a couple modifications to it to get it nice. So I'll talk a little bit about and show you a little bit about how to make this functional piece of hardware for your shop. If you're only going to have one hammer in your inventory, depending on what you're doing, like I said, 16-ounce Estwing is your go-to, or a wooden handle if you're doing framing, which that's a non sequitur now because people use pneumatic fasteners, so a wooden handle is, while nice in homage to a time long gone, it's no longer necessary. You're not going to use a hammer enough that this is going to kill you. Pretend this is a stick nailer. Largely the function of the hammer now is to be used as a pry tool, where you adjust the piece that you're working on and then you nail it in place. So the primary function of a hammer, on at least with respect to framing now, is more of a persuasion tool. And it's much less used as a primary nail driver. In fact, given the price of hand nails now, hand nailing's kind of cost inefficient, which is a shame, because I still maintain that, having developed skill both as a stick nailer and as a hand nailer, I still maintain that hand nailing is the more elegant and more quality approach. If I were to do my own house, I would really only use the stick nailer for very, very specific things, floor joists and wall studs on straight runs, and probably that's it. There's no comparison to the split-free performance of something well toe-nailed. Let's talk about steel. When I tell you that you should own one of these hammers since they're only $5, many of you are going to say, but the steel isn't as hard. Why do you have to have hard steel? Really? Why is it so necessary that you have such hard steel? People make the same argument to me over the junky Harbor Freight hatchets that you can buy for about $7. They swear that their more expensive hatchet is a better buy, and perhaps it does hold an edge longer. But let's remember, human beings lived hundreds of thousands of years making rudimentary tools that were nowhere near as hard as the mildest steel that modern industry can provide us with. You simply do not need hard metal to accomplish most of your day in, day out tasks. Further, the pinging that hard metal makes is just more shock up the elbow. It almost has a nice, softened, attenuated sort of feel, a dead blow sort of feel, to use a slightly softer hammer after all of these years. And it's also less likely to damage things. Chances are an Estwing will leave a ding in my vice's table, which I don't need. I would rather have a disposable hammer. The handle on it is some kind of hardwood, and it's a very traditional head. The shape is not too far removed from an Estwing, but in fact I think it looks more like the Vaughn. I'll say that the most skilled hammer user that I've ever seen in my life was my old man. Whatever experience in hand nailing I had at my peak, and add an additional 30 years to it, and then you have him. He was just simply a beast. And when you watched him, he was almost fumbling in a way, if you didn't know any better, because the way that he used it was just effortless. It was effortless to him. Of course, he also ended up with a bad elbow, and despite his warnings, I ended up with one as well. But This is reminiscent of the type of hammer that he carried. It was a 32 ounce Vaughan. I couldn't even say how many decades he carried that hammer. Yeah, 32 ounces, that's 2 of these. But the point was to reduce energy expenditure. Yeah, he switched to something like this when he was doing soffit and fascia. It didn't need to be so heavy for driving smaller nails. But to return to that point about you don't know how to use a hammer until you're forced to learn how to use a hammer because of limitation. Young men, you'll see, they take pride in just their ability to really drive nails quickly. But what they don't quite get early on is that the game is really about energy expenditure, and it's about the mathematics of efficiency over time. And I remember arguing with workmates over this, that it's not so much how hard you're willing to push yourself so much as how smart you are in applying yourself so that over the long haul you can continue to perform. In other words, if you're sinking nails in 3 hits really hard and quick, great, but how long can you keep that rate up for? I had a boss who was a roofer once who displayed energy efficiency perfectly with his ability to hand nail. He could hand nail shingles faster than most of the younger guys could use a coil nailer. And I saw him do this. I saw him outperform. See, a coil nailer requires that you load it and you set your own shingles and everything, and as a self-sufficient, autonomous single roofer can perform without help, a hammer has a lot of elegance that works in its favor. It just is subject to less error. And so my old boss would show this to the young cocky guys every once in a while. He was a monster. It was that his continuity ended up catching up with the young cocky roofers that would go real fast. Holding the trigger in with the coil nailer, and you go bop, 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 bop. No, he was just tortoise and hare, And so, energy efficiency, that brings me back to this. In a shop where there are all sorts of nooks and crannies around here where this might lie and hide, I would rather just have a hammer on a hook every couple feet. There's one everywhere. And that keeps me from searching or from walking too far. And so I conserve energy by having multiple hammers rather than, as I used to, just one trusty tool in my loop all the time. Though it is hard not to become sentimental about your certain special hammer, because my 22-ounce S-Wing, for example, has saved my life on more than one occasion. Sliding off of a roof and you sink it into the roof through the sheathing, and it will stop you from sliding. Yes, I've done that. These are all 16-ounce, but look at this gem I forgot to show you. I'm not really sure what size it is, but look how tiny it is. I'm not sure if you can still get one of these. Handy for really tiny things. And so, in terms of narrative continuity, that brings us to now. I had first filmed what you saw as the previous video first as the closing sequence to this video. But I figured nobody would really watch it, except for you. And so I'd like to leave you with a closing thought about tool design. So there was this Greek philosopher named Plato. Maybe you've heard of him. He was like one of the most influential of all time. This is about something like 2,400 years ago. And he had this idea, he called it the theory of forms, that there was this ideal to something, to everything. Everything had an ideal. wood has an ideal. There's a quality of woodness that it's a concept, like an overarching concept that applies to all species or things or varieties of wood. And you can tell how woody something is, or its woodness, by how much it adheres to this paradigm, this, wow, it's hard to explain, this concept that applies to all things wood. Similarly, a hammer would have hammerness. There's a universal set of qualities that apply to all hammers. And so if you think about that when you look at a tool, something like a corporate tool, especially like in the case of this cheapy Harbor Freight tool, they make it super efficient, super cheap, and super simplified. It's stripped away of any extraneous features like magnets and things that you don't really need. It just comes down to brass tacks. It just gives you what you need to do your hammering. And as such, it's prudent from a corporate point of view to manufacture products that are really close to an ideal. And when you come to something like this that is so close to that ideal, to that overarching paradigm that fits all hammers, like the mental image that you have of hammer in your head, if the product closely resembles that, then it's really reduced in its simplicity enough such that it's probably a good tool to that purpose. Long story short, in the case of a tool like this that's been around since Plato and before, a hammer has been approaching an optimum. And once you get something that's at an optimum, if you change it, that change will only be for the worse.